So yeah, thank you, Parasite, for having me, and thank you all my students and friends who received my email bomb and turned up today. That's wonderful. So I'll just get right into it. So title of the talk is Superficial Engagements: How Art Attempts to Channel the Critical Agency of Poor Images in an Age of Social Media. So when Shinyi and Kosmin first invited me to take part in this conference, I was slated to do a presentation under a session titled Image Making in an Era of Poor Images and Cinematic Landscapes. So later I learned that this panel was cut, and I don't know what the reason was, right? There was some sort of reshuffling. And I was reassigned to this discussion that we are sort of engaged in today. And but I would like, however, to still frame my presentation under the rubric of this earlier panel that never was, primarily because I consider the notion of poor images, or even poor imaging, to be of immense political significance to the historical condition that we find ourselves in today. So I will begin by mentioning a few key points that I hope to clarify with more concrete examples as we move along. The first concerns my methodology. I think that any discussion regarding the political agency of art must at some point or other take into account the question of form, not as something optical, technical, or even directly perceptible, but rather the way in which cultural forms manifest themselves as symptoms of specific sets of social or ideological relationships, i.e., how is it possible to discuss the forms of art without falling back into vapid formalisms? My next point concerns terminology, namely what I understand as poor images takes on many complex and overlapping guises. For the sake of discussion, I have singled out three kinds of poor images, which are by no means mutually exclusive. The first one I call the generic image. This is the category that probably first comes to mind when we think of poor images. It is the outcome of the ubiquitous accumulation of images brought about by progressive developments in communications and imaging technologies from the beginning of the 20th century to the present, from the invention of the camera all the way through to our mass dependence on the internet and mobile phones. Today, the generic image finds its ideal breeding ground in social networking sites such as Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Twitter. It is typified by reified metaphors or cliches of cuteness, like this cat here, yeah? Cuteness. I'll just let you have a look, right? I'm the Queen of France. Nature, right? So coral reefs, waterfalls. Travel to exotic places, right? And leisure, the sort of tropical beach getaway kind of idea, right? Even the most banal moments of everyday life are not immune to this collective exhibitionism provided by countless amateur and professional photographers alike, driven by the desire to share every minutiae of their existence with who knows who, or perhaps you might say this sort of friend circle, kind of virtualized imagined community, or a metanational state of the commons, right? So, and this is, this sort of, I don't know, people do have this thing where they when they get on a plane, they like to take a picture of the boarding gate. I never really understand why that happens, right? So, superficially, one could argue that the poverty of the generic image lies in its portability, and as a result, its disposability. As we all know, many images that are circulated on the web are compressed into smaller sizes and portable file formats like the images I'm showing you today, to make them easier to load on slow internet connections or on smartphones. Here, the visual quality of the image is sacrificed for the sake of a quantitative increase in its circulation. But more importantly, the situation that this increased circulation necessitates is a wholesale impoverishment of meaning in all its richness and contextual or historical contingency. Which is not to say that generic images are meaningless, only that their meanings have been distilled or purified to the point where they can be understood immediately, bypassing the faculty of reflection to elicit an automatic response. So, cat means cute, coral reef means nature, tropical beach means holiday, pyramids and camels means Egypt or the exotic, right? So a generic image is a ready-made image, since its meanings are always and already predetermined. Okay, so that's the sort of first classification of poor image that I'm presenting. The second one that I would sort of locate is this notion of the decadent image, which is basically a kind of sort of appropriation of the generic. So the decadent image draws on the stockpile of generic images that I've just described and combines these with a state-of-the-art production values, resulting in the equally ubiquitous cocktail of seductive imagery that we see on TV commercials, billboards, Hollywood blockbusters, not to mention biennials, galleries, fairs, i.e., what the situationists called the society of the spectacle. So this is, that's a piece by Bill Viola, which I would basically call a decadent image. I mean, he's one of the only artists that I can kind of categorically say that I dislike, right? And of course, this is James Bond from Skyfall, okay? So, being subject to the laws and logic of market-driven ideologies, the primary aim of the decadent image is to encourage consumption. What is more immediate and efficient way than to accomplish this task, but to appeal to the knee-jerk and sometimes unconscious desires and gratifications afforded by the generic. Even if the decadent image does not look poor, it certainly is designed to make you, the spectator, literally poor in the wallet for looking. And maybe just drawing from maybe some of the things that were said today, Anthony was talking about socialist realism. And I think I would see, the decadent image or even the generic as a kind of socialist realism for an advanced capitalist global economy, basically. And it's not this thing about when attitudes become form, but rather this notion of when ideology becomes form. I mean, that is the decadent image. So, and then my next question mark. The next example of the poor image is slightly different, but sort of interchangeable in a way. It's this notion that I would call, and it was something that was mentioned yesterday, the precarious image. This idea of precarity. This third state of the poor image encompasses what I see as an attempt by specific contemporary art practices to tackle the problem of the generic and the decadent image head-on. Rather than trying to avoid the generic or decadent image or criticize it from the outside, in other words, from a kind of exclusive, high modernist, privileged cultural hierarchy, the precarious image takes this condition of impoverishment as a starting point for further investigation, acknowledging the fact that even the lowest and most despicable cultural products can seduce, control, perhaps even touch you, despite what you think or know about them. Right? So, I mean, my own confession would be when I watched James Bond and when I watched Skyfall, there's that scene where Judi Dench, she dies, right? This sort of M, the character. I mean, I too felt a tear welling up in my eye in that scene, honestly, right? So, or maybe more seriously, right? Maybe, again, drawing from what Austin was saying, this notion of a fascinating fascism, I think, is also quite relevant in this context, right? So, yeah, without irony or cynicism, the practitioner of the precarious sets out on the unabashedly utopian project of resurrecting the truth of the image. In the words of the Swiss artist Thomas Hirschhorn, who basically I am indebted for this notion of precarity that I speak of today, quote, "Nothing is more boring than something definitive, something sure, something safe, because it isn't true. The true can only be touched in art with hazardness, movements, headless, contradictory, and hidden encounters. I want to reestablish the word precarious. Precariousness can be a tool to work out contemporary problematics involving economics, social, religious, political, and cultural issues." So in order to better locate this slippery notion of the precarious image, I would like to make a sort of little digression, a sort of shameless self-promotion into my own practice before moving on to some more representative examples. So this here is a two-part installation that I produced in 2010. It was called Cataract. The starting point for this project were two images of Victoria Falls, right? Downloaded from the public archives of the Smithsonian Institute. So now, waterfalls, as you have seen previously, I would argue, being this sort of sublime natural phenomena that they are, have become something of an automatic portal to some vague and generic idea of nature. So if you try and do a Google image search with the word nature, you will find images of waterfalls everywhere. Similarly, if you were to do an image search of Victoria Falls or Niagara Horseshoe Falls, for example, you would discover image after image taken by different people in different moments, but with very similar vantage points and composition. All of these similar images have effectively gelled into one collective image, which is the ultimate cliché of Victoria or Niagara Falls, depending on the image. So much so that no trip to the actual site would seem complete without finding the spot where tourists take the same picture over and over and over again. So here is a situation where a kind of collective image or memory exists that is shared between people, or to be more precise, people who are living in societies where modern conditions of production prevail, even if those people have never been to the waterfalls in question and seen them with their own eyes. The image, one might say, is already in the mind's eye before the photograph is taken, so what is eventually captured is not reality, but cliches. This is, of course, just another definition of the generic image, and it is here that we return to very old debates about how the circulation of photographic images has come to supersede the uniqueness of everyday reality, a process that as I've already mentioned, was greatly accelerated and accentuated by the internet. So, is it possible to resituate the generic, to reinstate the uniqueness of the moment and possibly the truth of the image? Or to put it another way, what is the reality of the generic? These were the questions that informed the thought processes behind the Cataract project. And in hindsight, I think my approach was to forego any notion of the natural, to acknowledge that this image of Victoria Falls no longer has anything to do, anything but the most arbitrary relationship to an actual waterfall. That it represents nothing more than some kind of popular idea of the sublime excesses of a nature which may not even exist. This image, then, is artificial, a human, all too human construct that requires its own specific kind of artificial setting. As you will see, the strategy that I employed was to combine the generic with more of the generic. So with a little help, I managed to contact a factory that makes these sort of kitschy light boxes, that you see quite often in cafes and offices in China and sometimes in kind of old places in Hong Kong, which contain this sort of internal scrolling mechanism behind. So that's a transparency you see in the front with a waterfall, and it's basically a light box. And the movement of the mechanism inside makes it look like the water is falling. They also have it in Mexico, with this sort of bleeding heart. I don't know if you've seen that. So to this, I basically appropriated this sort of product, and I got the factory to make a custom version for me, and I added those images of Victoria Falls into the light box, and then I fitted on top of everything an aluminium window designed after the ones that are seen in buildings all over Hong Kong. Or maybe not in a fancy building like this, but if you go outside in the street, you see this sort of aluminium, very generic window grate designs. What I tried to do then with these modified kinetic light boxes was to provide the generic image with a generic setting. And this setting for me had to be none other than the urban setting of the generic city. The window design, of course, is stereotypically urban, but also the kitsch effect of the scrolling light box. Here I think it will suffice to recall Clement Greenberg's definition of kitsch, disregarding his conclusions about the matter, as an ersatz art and culture of the urbanized masses that was generated following the advent of the Industrial Revolution. So that was the sort of first part of the installation, right? And there was two spaces. So I was lucky enough to have access to two separate spaces, which were only a few steps away from each other. And in the other space, which was hidden away in a dark alleyway, I decided to construct a scene that would depict, as it were, the other side of this window. In keeping with the generic urban thematic, I decided to build this monolithic freestanding shower structure with the cheap tiles that you find in apartment blocks or public toilets. The shower ran on a pump mechanism that recycled the water so that it would run continuously for the duration of the exhibition. The tiled windows on the wall, there, were modeled after the dimensions of the light box in the other space, the light boxes, setting up a kind of symbolic threshold between the two different environments. To further amplify this connection, a sound sample of Victoria Falls, a kind of field recording, was played on loop in both spaces. As you can see here, a stainless steel rail was erected in the entrance of the exhibition space to block passage into the installation. The insertion of this barrier was an attempt to mimic the trappings of a tourist site, which often for safety and other reasons erect barriers behind which you can ogle at the wonders of the world, whether it be waterfalls or pyramids or whatever. It also provided a convenient pretext to enhance the photogenic quality of the space, to limit the angle of view, much like a camera does when it frames a shot. Right. So there you have it, the trope of Victoria Falls modulated as two very different kinds of visceral experience. To put it bluntly, the light boxes present us with a tourist eye view of Victoria Falls, whereas the shower scene is this view made flesh. Obviously, in neither case did I expect the viewer to believe that they were looking at an actual waterfall. I was more interested in leaving room for the image to work on the imagination, to leave the work open to the seductions of the generic, while simultaneously putting the mechanisms of construction in plain view. It is often said that the most disappointing thing about stage magic, David Copperfield sort of thing, right, is the moment when you discover how the trick is done, simply because it's so banal. When you find out how the trick is, like this really stupid technique that is used or something. With this work, I would like to suggest otherwise, that today it is really the illusion itself that is banal. It's David Copperfield, is banal. Since there is actually nothing more baffling than reality itself, a sphinx without a secret. So if we come back to this notion of the precarious image, which I think we're sort of starting to touch on, I believe that in order to locate the reality of the generic, it is necessary to work with the image on a superficial basis, not to look deeper or fathom the inner meanings of the image, right? Which, as I've already pointed out, is in terms of the generic, are always fixed and predetermined. But so to step back and situate the generic image in relation to the world. These relationships are, of course, determined by constantly changing and mutating social, political, cultural, historical, psychological factors. And it is these factors that lend images their precarious character. To borrow again from Hirschhorn, ephemera, I quote, is what comes from nature. Precariousness is what comes from the human. Precariousness to me is not negative. Precariousness is the photography of endless movement. Precariousness is not the end and not the beginning. Precariousness is a moment. It is an instant. And in order to reach this unique moment, I have to be present. I have to be there. So precariousness then in visual art, you might say, could be defined as a radical form of contextualization of the image, not just in relation to the formal properties of sight and physical space, all right? And this is kind of an important point, but in relation to the contingencies of history itself. For an artist to engage with the image in such a fashion, I think requires a certain kind of faith in the autonomy of art, in its contradictory capability to position itself at a remove from the world, yet somehow still contribute as an active agent of change and transformation. In other words, that art can be political without becoming a glorified form of social work. This is the contradiction of art, I think. Also, I would like to argue this faith in autonomy, this belief in art, is really born out of the doubt that surrounds belief itself. Without the faculty of doubt, there is no precarity. So I will try to elaborate my point here with a negative example, which is basically that of a decadent image. So I'm going to show you a video quickly.
To the curious, the inquisitive, the seekers of knowledge, to the ones who just want to know about life, about the universe, about yourself. Not cute questions, big questions, ones that matter. To the rebels, the artists, the free thinkers, and the innovators, who care less about labels and more about truth, who believe nonconformity is more than a bumper sticker, that knowledge is more than words on a page. You're young, you're old, you're powerful beyond measure, and the fuel of that power is not magic or mysticism, but knowledge. The things you see, the things you feel, the things you know to be true. Sure, some will doubt you. Let them. Dare to think for yourself, to look for yourself, to make up your own mind. Because in the eternal debate for answers, the one thing that's true is what's true for you.
So, any Scientologists in the house? No. So the video we've just watched is a recent promotional clip produced by the Church of Scientology, which ran during the Super Bowl events across the US alongside Budweiser and Mercedes and Coca-Cola ads, right? For the uninitiated, Scientology is this very controversial 20th century religion founded in 1954 by the science fiction writer Ron L. Hubbard. It was developed out of Hubbard's earlier psychotherapeutic self-help system, Dianetics. The Church of Scientology is an officially sanctioned, tax-exempt religious organization in the US and many other countries around the world, but at the same time it is considered a pseudo-religious cult or blatantly commercial venture by others. It is a religion of choice for celebrities like Tom Cruise. So it's Tom Cruise there, and that's David Miscavige, the spiritual leader of the Church of Scientology. This is the Top Gun pose. Other celebrities, Isaac Hayes, John Travolta, Juliette Lewis, Beck Hansen, and apparently even Charles Manson at an early stage of his career. I don't want to go into debate surrounding the question of Scientology's legitimacy. What I'm really interested here is the use of images and how that relates to the question of belief, which is something that effectively concerns all forms of institutionalized religion, so not just Scientology itself. I think we can all agree to the decadence of the ad that I just showed you. Like many commercials, it appeals to the politically correct, readily assimilated notions of multiculturalism, individualism, and watered-down non-conformism. The message that it tries to promote is a reasonable one, that it is necessary to make up your own mind about the meaning of life, and that this can be done through the application of a powerful knowledge that is more than just words on a page. A rational, measurable knowledge as opposed to the irrational superstitions of magic and mysticism. But where does this knowledge reside? In the Scientological doctrine, of course, and for a nominal fee. And if anyone doubts this, then let them, because you know. So, what this basically materialist account leaves out is that knowledge itself is a social product, and that every individual's understanding of the world is subject to socially determined power structures that are outside of the purview of individuals alone. So if you would let me quote Karl Marx, I know it's kind of he wrote in this dialectical critique of Ludwig Feuerbach, I don't know, mind my German, who wrote about contemplative materialism. So this is Marx's critique. Feuerbach resolves the essence of religion into the essence of man. But the essence of man is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In reality, it is the ensemble of social relations. So if one were to speak of the ideological determinations of Scientology as a system of belief, I would argue that it seeks to naturalize knowledge as eternal law, and in doing so, dispense with the necessity of belief itself. I hope you can see the dangers inherent in this sort of thinking, which paves the way towards a peculiar brand of religious fundamentalism, no pun intended. For what is fundamentalism but the strict adherence to the material forms of religion, where adherence to the law supersedes fidelity to the truth? Truth, that is, as something that needs to be constantly put to the test, that needs to be constantly resituated in relation to the mutating currents of history and humanity. A truth, then, that is born of doubt or the anxiety over its practical efficacy in the world. Paradoxically, the fundamentalist does not need to believe, precisely because for the fundamentalist, truth is replaced by fact, by an incontestable and predetermined form of knowledge. As a little footnote to these comments on Scientology, I would like to draw your attention to this series of images of David Miscavige, again, the spiritual leader of the Church of Scientology. These were downloaded from the Scientology website, Scientology.org, if you want to check it out, documenting church openings around the world. Hence, they embody part of the carefully selected image that the organization wants to present to the public. So I find these images extremely fascinating because they shed light on some other characteristics of the generic and the decadent image. What we have here is something very similar to the waterfall images that I was discussing earlier with Niagara Falls, but with a very important twist. So each image is meticulously staged and similar in visual composition, as you see. But with the symmetrical podium, the backdrop, with the two signs of Scientology and Dianetics there. The Colgate white smile of Miscavige. This is the eternal face of the church that borrows from the generic image of natural and man-made wonders that have endured from time immemorial. Right? Of course, this is the image they want to present. But of course, Scientology is a 20th century religion. Right? But what is even more sinister than the similar lies in the details, in the differences between each and every other image. Like I mentioned, each shot comes from a particular church inauguration in a different part of America or the rest of the world. Consequently, what we find, interestingly, is subtle modulations of color and ornament, which properly situates, in fact, each image within a particular geographical context. So the genius of these images is that they do not deny their staged aspect. In fact, they openly state this as a fact, which does not require any explanation. If I state the fact of staging the generic without explaining it, I am very close to finding that it is natural and goes without saying, and I am reassured. So hence, what is really generic about these images is not so much their similarity, which is very obvious, but the way in which they manage to homogenize difference itself. Here it is enough that the generic has two sides for it to always have an elsewhere, or better yet, an alibi at its disposal. The similar, the staged, is always there to present the difference, which is the geographical context, right? And the difference is always there to outdistance the similar. What I've just described might seem at first glance to fly in the face of everything that I've said about precarity and the necessity or critical agency of resituating the image. But I think it is precisely by attending to these reversibilities and mutations that one can get to the heart of precarity as method. So let me repeat that the practice of precariousness requires that the image be resituated and recontextualized, not just in relation to the formal properties of sight and physical space, which would amount to nothing more than this sense of homogenizing the difference, but in relation to the contingencies of history. Precariousness in art must be understood not just as a formal property, but as an ontological state. To conclude with an example, or a few examples, I would like to draw on my final sort of artistic example of precariousness in practice, which I locate in the work of a Japanese artist, Meiro Koizumi. This is Meiro himself, actually, in one of his works. So, like the work of Thomas Hirschhorn, I think that the impact of Koizumi's work rests on the surface of its images. They are superficial engagements, which is actually a title of a Hirschhorn project, that aim less to construct meaning, but to construct, paraphrasing Koizumi, to construct energy so that the moving images are the very representation of energy. Navigating a multidisciplinary practice of video, performance, drawing, and installation, Koizumi draws upon a wide range of tropes from history and popular culture, from cliches of multiculturalism in Hollywood films like The Last Samurai, featuring Tom Cruise, to the rise and fall and subsequent rise of Japanese nationalism following the Second World War to the present day. It would be impossible for me to do justice to this sort of enormous scope of Meira's work, but I will try to touch on a few points by way of introduction to 3 early video works by him. The following extracts that I will show are from videos that were produced during Koizumi's residency in London and Amsterdam, respectively. They can be read in relation to the social conditions that he witnessed and was influenced by during these formative years as a student. This, however, does not mean that these conditions should provide an explanation for the video or videos. I don't think it is necessary to look for a secret story behind the images. I think that the whole point, in fact, is that they should literally be taken at face value. So, we show the first one. Can you show the next one, James? Jim? Yeah, thanks. So that was the first one was called Amazing Grace. This next video is called The Art of Awakening. I'll talk about these in a bit.
How do you feel? Nice.
So you hear the artist is talking to the guy. How do you feel? Nice. Okay, due to time restrictions, I'm just going to stop there. All right. Amazing Grace, the first one. In this variation of the sad clown, the artist, with a painted face and cigarette dangling out of his mouth, proceeds to film himself mumbling the hymn, Amazing Grace, at the same time slapping his face with a ruler. To paraphrase Koizumi, this work sets up a situation whereby everything is exaggerated to the point where only the superficial remains within the space of the frame. In later works, this self-inflicted cruelty is redirected and complicated by the addition of both amateur and professional actors, further introducing various manipulative tactics to make the viewer more and more complicit in the imagining of the on-screen processes. For instance, in that second video that I showed you, The Art of Awakening, 3 men are called to a studio and asked by the artist who is standing behind the camera, "Do you want to feel the freedom of spirit?" And when they answer in the affirmative, they are instructed to pick up a stick and poke at an off-screen object for unspecified duration. So due to the ambiguity of the image presented, one is left to ponder the obscene consequences of having the object revealed. As Koizumi notes, I wanted to create a work that would function as a masturbation device of the moving images. Yet at the end of the video, all is revealed, actually. You see what they're poking, right? The object is a mere rubbish-filled plastic bag, and the artist burst out laughing. You saw a bit of the sort of laughing moment there. What I would argue is that what is more obscene than this obliteration of the scene that was building up in your mind? So the final video, so I'm just going to, if there's enough time, that I want to show are the opening scenes of another work called Human Opera, XXX. Returning to the theme of sadness, this time at another's expense, Koizumi placed an ad in a Dutch newspaper offering to pay anyone willing to tell the tragic story of their life in front of the camera. Made to sit in a set that resembles something thrown together from a cheap sci-fi B-movie, the man proceeds to tell the story of his troubled relationship with his ex-girlfriend and how he lost his daughter in a car accident. Through this confession, however, throughout this confession, the man is constantly interrupted by the alien figure of the artist, whose face is painted silver there, and who claims to be dissatisfied with the aesthetic quality of the image that he wants to compose. The man, who is initially resistant to the increasingly absurd demands that he is asked to perform, eventually capitulates in abject humiliation. So that's sort of the closing scenes. So again, there is a certain sense of complicity and guilt that we as the audience are faced with when witnessing such acts of cruel manipulation. Yet what is this awkward anxiety but the affective capacity for the images to touch us? A situation where our empathy with the pain and suffering that we are confronted with on a daily basis, on TV, in the news, in movies, can no longer be reduced to an empty gesture, where loving thy neighbor cannot be, to paraphrase the Scientology ad, reduced to just words on a page. So I don't think it's a coincidence, right, that biographically Meiro Koizumi was born into a family of devout Christians, actually. And next point about that video, the XXX of the title, so Human Opera XXX, refers to both the symbol of Amsterdam, he was doing his residency at the Rijksacademy, and the three crosses on the coat of arms of Amsterdam. But also, of course, the code name for the sex trade and hardcore porn that Amsterdam is also notorious for. I would argue, or even insist, that there is something strangely pornographic about what Koizumi presents us in his videos. Here I would like to draw on Slavoj Žižek's brilliant description of the essential conservatism of pornography, that what is sacrificed in the drive to reveal everything, nudity, penetration, and all that, in this crossing of thresholds, is the ability to engage intimately with the narrative. In porn films, it is very difficult to take the narrative seriously, that there can be no emotional engagement with the fictional or storytelling element. So the example that Zizek uses is this sort of stupid story, about the housewife who calls a plumber over to plug a pipe, only to tell him that she needs another one plugging, right? So similarly, Koizumi attempts to reveal all, actually, right? From the formal mechanisms of construction in the videos to the psychological dynamics of the actor-director-audience relationship. And this brings about, I would argue, a literal disruption of the narrative elements in the work. For example, the interruptions that are leveled at the man who is telling his life story in Human Opera leads us to doubt the validity of his claims, to leave us wondering if what we are watching is really just some sick joke on the part of the artist. What Koizumi's work reveals is the pornography of that which is already in plain view. That is our consummate desire to see more, to know more, i.e., to consume more of the spectacle of contemporary society. This, you might say, is a truly, in Koizumi's case, a truly radical form of pornography. It's not this sort of other kind of pornography, not the henceforth conservative pornography of transgression, but a radical pornography of pure transmission. So just few last words. In a 2009 lecture, Koizumi mentions, going back to this other example, his fascination with The Last Samurai, right, which he succinctly describes as Dances with Wolves, but about Japan. I don't know if you've seen the Kevin Costner film. this sort of story of the white messiah who comes to show people how to practice their own culture, right? Avatar was another example of that, right? With regard to the Western gaze on Japan, or the cliche of East meets West, Koizumi contrasts what he calls the sick, sugar-coated image of multiculturalism embodied by The Last Samurai, as Tom Cruise shows us here, with this conversely healthy, more tuned-in image of something like Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill. He then makes this surprising claim that if he had to choose between Kill Bill and The Last Samurai as a motivational role model for his own work, he would choose The Last Samurai. I think that this statement reveals a lot about the intentions that color Koizumi's work, rather than take the cynical postmodern approach of ironic distance, which of course in its own way, in the form of satire and things like that, also plays a very important role in social critique. But instead, Koizumi chooses to start with, or even aspire towards, sentimentalism and kitsch. In another context, Koizumi notes, people like, I quote, the image of a strawberry field, but they don't like mulch, which is basically compost shit. I feel like my art is a little like mulch. Maybe good for society, but it stinks. That's how our food will grow, but you don't have to deal with it every day. These, after all, are the conditions of a precarious art which places faith in turning impoverishment and the sometimes foul excesses of contemporary society into a paradoxical form of nourishment. Okay, thank you. So, should I show the video? Is there time? Thanks. The Human Opera XXX.
Can I have your name, please?
Rob Hoekstra.
Rob, can you lift the finger? No, not the. Can you show your forehead?
Yeah.
Yeah. When I ask the questions, can you show the whole forehead?
Yeah.
With your scar, is this? Okay. Yeah. And please come forward a bit.
Yeah.
Can you show it a bit more clearly? Show it like this. Okay. Can I have your name, please?
Rob Hoekstra.
Okay. How old are you?
I'm 42.
42. And what is your occupation?
Computer engineer.
Where are you from?
Amsterdam.
I'm from Amsterdam. Okay. So today you brought a very sad story of your life.
Yes.
You can share with us. Is
Yes.
that right?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Is this a true story of your life?
Yes.
Okay. So can you tell us about it?
Yes. Well, I've written it on a poem. I've made a poem and written it down. I would like to read it as a poem.
Okay. Please wait. Let's see. Okay, instead of telling the story, you want to read the poem.
Yes.
And the poem tells your sadness.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I prefer you to tell the story in more direct way, more ordinary way. So I think I want to read the poem later. Can I read the poem later? But in front of the camera, I think I want you to tell the story in more direct way, more in a more like a storytelling way.
Oh, okay. So not the poem.
Not the poem. I'm sorry, but I think yes. I prefer you to tell the story.
Okay.
Yeah. If it is okay with you.
Yeah.
Okay. Then please.
Well, where can I start? Well, it all started 5 years ago, some 5 years ago. I met this girl and she became my girlfriend. We had a lot of fun. And we had so much fun that suddenly she was pregnant. And, well, we didn't know what to do, but we decided to keep the child. And then she was born. We named her Angelina. Well, I still think she was the best thing that happened to me ever.
Sorry to interrupt you, but okay. I think the whole image, something's missing in the image. Can you hold this? Yeah? Hold that? No, it's too small. I want you to hold something big. Hold this. Hold this. Yeah.
Is this necessary?
Sorry?
What is it?
So yes, the image is now too dull, too quiet. So I need something more vivid, like a red color like that. Okay, can you just hold that? And can you continue the story?
Sure.
Yeah. So so you had a baby.
Yeah, Angelina. Yeah, she's very
Please
nice.
tell us about it.
Very nice girl, and I was very fond of her. But the situation with my girlfriend was not so good, and I had a lot of work to do, and I sort of got a drinking problem.
Sorry. Sorry, I think this is not working yet.
Oh, good riddance.
Thank you. I'm just trying to wrap my head around the relationship between people making images and, I don't know, people contextualizing images. And so I think of like this guy in this video is somehow making the guy telling the sad story is contributing to an image that he who knows what he wants to make, but then Kozumi is coming in and making his own image out of it. And now I'm thinking of the people who take pictures of the falls, and of you as an artist then taking some of these images and contextualizing them in the way that you described, as a kind of drawing attention to their precarity, or somehow drawing attention to the precarity. But I guess what I'm trying to think about, and it's not a question, it's like a whole complex of associations that is too long for this kind of context of the burden of the one question at the end of a talk. But I'll just throw it out there. Maybe we can talk more in the plenary. But is then the poverty of the image? Is the poverty of the image? It's purely an aesthetic category, and there's not a kind of social category to it? Is some of these images of the falls that someone would take, the image, of course, may serve as like a mnemonic device, so that the person wants to remember their loved one who fell off into the falls, or the moment that they were standing there and they proposed to marry the person next to them, and that's why that image for them is not poor, but is indeed rich. But then, even posted on their Facebook page, it's still rich because it's available to friends and friends of friends and friends. So I'm just trying to think about this association, and if you have some thoughts about that in relation to artistic practice and the use of these images, and to, let's say, scholarly practice, if we want to, which I think is what you have shown us quite capably and interestingly in the way that you talk about this work.
I think maybe this boils down to this sort of interchangeability of these images. So, I had to sort of classify it in a way, just for the sake of, explanation. But really, in many cases, I think a lot of these things overlap and they're not mutually exclusive, as I mentioned. And, I think, and like maybe related to what you were saying just now about this sort of idea of an image setting up a kind of discursive practice, that surrounds image or that actually constructs images. I think the problem with the generic, in some senses, in this one sense, is that it basically stops that discursive moment. It sort of cuts it. It starts at one point and then doesn't go anywhere. And I guess this notion of different people having a different kind of emotional engagement with the images would be maybe linked to this notion that I was saying with the decadent image, that it is not necessarily something that you can just brush away. That in fact, in some senses, even if you know what it is, it can still act on you in ways that you can't control. Right? This sort of actually very psychological dimension. And I think the ambiguity rests in the relationship between these poles. Right.